that be appropriate for your office?
I would figure out what was the right thing for the FBI to do and then do that thing.
And that right thing would be not to be in the business of confirming or denying stories about classified information.
Correct. That's what the right thing is for the FBI.
Let me recognize Mr. Quigley for the purposes of entering something in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. As I do that, I'm reminded of what Hugo Black said: only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. I respectfully ask to enter a March 8th article entitled "Jeff Sessions Likely Met Russian Ambassador a Third Time."
I now yield to Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you to our ranking member, and thank you again to our director and Admiral Rogers. Director, would you agree that the FBI, when it's considering a counterintelligence investigation, views contacts between U.S. persons and, say, Russia differently than it would view contacts between U.S. persons and the U.K. or France or Germans?
Yes, very much so.
And that's because they're a foreign adversary?
Correct.
And so to land on Russia's radar is somebody that they may want to recruit. Would you agree that being a business person, a prominent business person, is something that would be attractive to them?
Could be. Might depend on what industry you were in.
Could also being a politician be something that would be attractive to them?
Sure.
And how about somebody who does business with Russians? Would that be attractive to them?
Could be. It would depend upon other things as well, though.
And we were starting to discuss this. Efforts to recruit include investing in a U.S. person. Is that correct?
Efforts by Russia to invest typically in their tradecraft, that can be one of the ways in which they cultivate a relationship, sure.
And if you are a U.S. person with a business, could it also include investing in your business or being a partner in some of your endeavors?
Lots of different ways someone could try and establish a relationship.
And going back to compromise, could we assume that any prominent U.S. person traveling to Russia would probably be covered by Russian surveillance?
Depending upon how you define prominent, but they have an extensive surveillance operation of foreign visitors. So no matter who you are, you ought to assume it, but whether that's true in reality is harder for me to answer. You want to answer that differently?
I agree.
And Russia is attempting to recruit and persuade individuals that we've discussed before, just as other foreign adversaries are, because they want to get something out of them. Is that right?
Correct.
And in many cases, it could be, if that person is ever in a position of power, that they could be in a position to influence policy in the United States.
To influence policy or supply them with information that's useful to them and maybe other purposes.
Now, with respect to your counterintelligence investigations, would it be important for you if you were concerned that a U.S. person had financial entanglements with a foreign adversary to see that person's tax returns?
Well, that's the hypothetical I really want to avoid answering, but the answer is it would depend, really. It would depend upon a whole lot of circumstances.
That would be one of the pieces of evidence that you would consider looking at?
Maybe. You might be able to get the picture you need from other financial records that are more readily available.
And you're aware, Director, that President Trump has refused, breaking with the tradition of the past 40 years, to show the American people his tax returns.
It's not something I want to comment on. I'm aware of it from the media.
Now, Russia also, in their efforts to recruit individuals and develop individuals, preying on or following someone's financial distress is also an avenue they may pursue. Is that right?
Potentially, if it offers an avenue for leverage on someone.
Right. And Director, would you consider 6 bankruptcies that an individual may have as being a point of leverage?
I can't say. I don't know.
And Director, you're aware that President Trump has had 6 prior bankruptcies.
It's not something I'm going to comment on.
And Director, when your agents are conducting a counterintelligence investigation with respect to a foreign adversary and their efforts to recruit or cooperate with a U.S. person, would you look at the U.S. person's travel to that country?
As part of evaluating whether there's an illicit relationship?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. And are you familiar that President Trump has traveled at least 3 times to Russia?
That's not something I'm going to comment on.
Okay. Are you aware that his son, Donald Trump Jr., has traveled at least 6 times to Russia?
Same answer.
Donald Trump has said a number of times that he has had nothing to do with Russia. And I want to ask you, Director, if you're familiar with Deutsche Bank and its $300 million loan to Donald Trump and his organization.
It's not something I'm going to comment on.
Director, are you aware that Deutsche Bank has been investigated and fined over $400 million by New York State for failing to stop the corrupt transfer of more than $10 billion out of Russia?
I think generally from press accounts.
So an individual's association with a bank that has had dealings with Russian money laundering, that would be something that would be a red flag for a counterintelligence investigation, I would assume.
That's a hypo I don't want to answer.
Director, would a U.S. business person who is associated with a foreign adversary having tenants in their office building that do business with that foreign adversary, would that be a red flag that a counterintelligence agent would look at?
Yeah, I can't answer that.
Are you aware that in Trump Tower were two tenants, Vadim Trincher and Anatoly Golubchik, who ran a high-stakes illegal gambling ring that was run out of Trump Tower?
Same answer.
And are you aware that the prosecutor in that case was U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara?
Same answer.
Are you aware, Director, that that U.S. Attorney was recently fired
Yes.
by the President of the United States?
Well, I don't know who fired him. I know from press accounts that he was asked to leave.
Director, are you aware of Felix Sater, a former Soviet official and advisor to the Trump Organization?
I'm not going to comment on that.
And Director, outside of Mr. Sater's relationship with the Trump Organization, are you aware that the FBI knew of Mr. Sater because of a $40 million stock fraud case that was prosecuted by the federal government?
Same answer.
Director, would a U.S. person having multiple trademarks, in addition to the other relationships that I just described, be a red flag for a counterintelligence investigation if those trademarks were in Russia?
Multiple trademark?
Yeah, registering trademarks in a foreign adversary's country.
I don't know what to make of that.
Okay. Were you aware that Donald Trump had 6 trademarks in Russia?
Not going to comment on that.
Were you aware that Donald Trump tried to market his Trump vodka brand in Russia?
Same answer.
Were you aware that Donald Trump ran Miss Universe 2013 out of Moscow?
Same answer.
Are you aware that Donald Trump Jr. said on a number of occasions that Russian money is pouring into the Trump Organization and that there is a disproportionate cross-section of the company's revenue coming from Russian money?
Same answer, Mr. Swalwell.
So hypothetically speaking, though, would a foreign adversary and its oligarchs having a disproportionate cross-section of a company's revenue coming from that country, would that be a red flag for a counterintelligence agent?
I'm trying to be helpful, but I'm not going to answer.
I understand.
Kind of hypo.
Thank you, Director. Director, are you familiar with a 2004 home purchase by President Trump in Palm Beach County for about $40 million?
Not going to comment on that.
Are you familiar with a 2008 sale of that same property for a 129% increase at about $98 million?
Same answer.
Are you aware that the buyer in 2008 was a Russian businessman?
Same answer.
And under the earlier hypothetical, would a foreign adversary's oligarch purchasing a home in the United States for 129% more than the home was purchased 4 years before, would that be a tool that a foreign adversary would use to try and recruit, develop, or bring somebody onto their side?
Same answer as before.
You said that it's likely or somebody should assume they're being surveilled when they were in Russia. Would you assume that Donald Trump was being surveilled in 2013 when he was in Moscow?
I'm not going to answer. I was trying to confine my answer to prominent people should assume, not students and all those people who might go there for a brief holiday. I don't think I'd ask them to assume that.
Right. Would it be safe to say that if Donald Trump was doing something he shouldn't have been doing while he was in Russia, the Russians probably saw it?
Same answer as before.
Would it be safe to assume that if a prominent person was doing something they shouldn't have been doing while they're in Russia, the Russians probably saw it?
Yeah, I would stick to what I said before about prominent people should assume.
Mr. Director, was Donald Trump under investigation during the campaign?
Same answer as before. I'm not going to answer that.
Is he under investigation now?
I'm not going to answer that. Please don't overinterpret what I've said. As the chair and ranking know, we have briefed them in great detail on the subjects of the investigation and what we're doing, but I'm not going to answer about anybody in this forum.
Director, from our perspective on the committee, the dots continue to connect President Trump, his team, people in his orbit, to Russia. And the questions that we have, it's quite simple. Are these merely 100 different coincidences, or is this a convergence where you're seeing deep personal, political, and financial ties meeting Russia's interference in our campaign? So I'm wondering, Director, with your extensive counterintelligence expertise, and in view of the Russian intelligence campaign to influence the election in which Donald Trump was the candidate, do you consider these number of connections between well-connected Russians and Donald Trump, the Trump organization, the Trump family, and the Trump campaign to be a coincidence or a convergence?
I'm not going to answer, Mr. Swalwell.
From your perspective, Director, have you ever seen in the history of American politics, or at least since you've been alive, any political candidate have this many connections, personal, political, and financial, to a foreign adversary?
Same answer.
Mr. Director and Admiral Rogers, this past election, our country was attacked. We were attacked by Russia. It was electronic. It was nearly invisible. Thanks to the hard work of the men and women who serve in our intelligence community, we know that the attack came from Russia. It was ordered by Vladimir Putin. He sought to help Donald Trump and to take down Hillary Clinton. The most disturbing finding for me and my fellow committee members is that Russia intends to do this again. And I see this as an opportunity for everyone on this committee, Republicans and Democrats, to not look in the rearview window, but to look forward and do everything we can to make sure that our country never again allows a foreign adversary to attack us. Because I think, Director, you and Admiral Rogers would agree that it's not only Russia that is sharpening the knives to go back at us or to go at our allies, it's also other countries who have similar capabilities. And so I think the best thing we can do now is unite around this investigation, have also a parallel independent commission to make sure we get to the bottom of what happened, why we were so vulnerable, and to assure the American people we will never let this happen again. And I yield back.
Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I can, gentlemen, go back to what we were talking about a little bit before with interference from the Russians possibly in through our media. Have Russians or Soviets historically attempted to spread disinformation through the U.S. media? As you mentioned, they've been there over decades trying to interfere. They use media as a resource.
We see them use media writ large as a resource to disseminate disinformation, false information.
And has that been pretty much regardless of who's in the White House?
It doesn't seem to tie to a particular political party, that tactic, if you will.
Thank you. Mr. Comey, have you ever formed, this is going back to the article from February 14th in the New York Times, have you ever formed and articulated an opinion about the article from February 14th in the New York Times?
Have I ever formed an articulated
opinion or articulated an opinion on that article?
Yeah, I don't want to say, Dr. Winstrup.
Okay, thank you. When I look at your jobs, and thank you for being there and doing your jobs, and I mean that sincerely. Your job, you observe and you investigate and you assess and you try to predict and you sometimes have to act. Would that be correct?
Sure.
In what you do. My question is, as far as predictions and actions, had Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election for the United States presidency, which certainly most had predicted, I would conject that even the Russians predicted that she would win. What were the Russians planning for November 9th and beyond that had she won? You mentioned before, and the reason I ask it, you mentioned before, you said they'll be back. My question is, have they left? Because I would contend they haven't left. This isn't something they're turning on and off. This is a constant. So any idea of what may have happened November 9th and beyond that had she won? The pattern has been to interrupt us regardless of who is in the
Sure.
White House.
Yeah, they want to mess with us in a continuing and general way. It's hard to answer the counterfactual. I assume they would have continued their efforts to undermine President-elect Clinton as they had begun doing during the summer, especially with the European allies, to create a divide there. and probably lots of other things. What I meant by they'll be back is they're not going away, but I meant that in the sense of their next opportunity to mess with our election is 2 years from now and then 4 years from now. That's what I meant by back.
Thank you. I think your job is difficult because there's a lot of conjecture about any relationship with Russians in general, and questions from me and others about, can I meet with the Russian ambassador? Does that get me investigated? Business ties here and there. You know, I mean, currently we share a space station with the Russians. We buy engines from the Russians for our rockets. And in the 90s, we had joint military exercises with the Russians. It gets a little bit tough for you guys to decide what and when do we investigate. And I appreciate you taking the time with us today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses, thank you both. You know, I'm impressed. I was a B-1 pilot when I took off. One of the first thoughts I had was, how long is it going to be till I get to go to the bathroom? You guys went almost 4 hours. Our plan was to keep you here until you were in such pain that you would just answer all of our questions. And I have a list of questions here, but I want to divert a little bit and follow up on some of the things that have been said here today. Mr. Comey, you confirmed that there's an investigation into Trump campaign officials. The fact that there's an open investigation does not indicate guilt, though, does it?
Certainly not.
And in fact, many times an investigation may find that there is no wrongdoing.
That's one of the reasons we don't talk about it, so we don't smear people who don't end up charged with anything.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I would say that is especially likely to have, when I say especially likely, I'm talking about to have a finding of no wrongdoing when there is a political motive. And if there's one thing that we've seen here today, I think, from some of the line of questionings, it's clearly been a certain political motive in some of the questions that have been asked to you. Mr. Clapper, the former DNI, and we all know who he is, this is someone who should know. I want to read what he said just a few weeks ago. But Mr. Clapper then went on to say that to his knowledge there was no evidence of collusion between members of the Trump campaign and the Russians. We did not conclude any evidence in our report. And when I say our report, that is the NSA, FBI, and CIA, with my office, the Director of National Intelligence, that had any reflection of collusion between the members of the Trump campaign and the Russians. There was no evidence of that in our report. Was Mr. Clapper wrong when he said that?
I think he's right about characterizing the report, which you all have read.
Well, I want you to know I agree with Mr. Clapper. And at this point, everyone on this dais should agree with Mr. Clapper, because we in the committee have seen no evidence, zero, that would indicate that there was collusion or criminal wrongdoing between any members of the previous administration or campaign and Russian officials. And then I'm going to comment very quickly on the leaks. You've said very clearly that it is a crime. Both of you have said that. You've indicated it endangers national security, which I certainly agree with, that it makes it hard for us to reauthorize very important tools that we will need in order to protect our national security, and many times it's inaccurate. And I would ask you then, if someone in the intelligence community has some concerns, if they feel like there's been an overreach or the government is doing something they shouldn't be doing, any government official, is there a process they can go to where they could make that known and express their concerns?
Yes. All of us in the intelligence community have robust whistleblower provisions that we educate our folks on, and part of the whistleblower track is they can bring information to the appropriate committee of Congress.
That's exactly right. And are both of your agencies capable of handling accusations such as that may be brought to your attention?
Yes.
And knowing that, I find it hard to justify any classified information that is leaked. And I hope you find those guys, and I hope you crack them on the head. Because as a former Air Force guy, a former military guy, who is committed to defending our national security, I think those guys are arrogant, and I think they're cowards. Because they won't stand up and make their case. They won't use the legal process. They hide behind some New York Times reporter and without showing who they are or actually showing the information they have, and they make these accusations and leak this information, and I say, I hope you find out who they are and you hold them accountable, and we should. For one thing, to disincentivize it from happening again, because it happens far too often. And I know you both agree with me on that. I'd like to shift quickly, if I could, to the integrity of the report which the previous DNI, when he determined, along with your acquiescence, I might add, both of you, that Russia developed a clear preference for Mr. Trump, and this is a huge deal. I mean, think about this story. The American people have been told, and some believe, that our president was elected maybe because of the influence of a foreign government. And I love you guys, you know that, and I defend you, and we respect what you do. But I do need to make this point, and that is the intelligence community is not perfect, is it?
Not perfect?
Yes.
Certainly not.
Certainly not.
I can speak for me. I don't know. He might be
Right.
perfect.
Mr. Rogers, I'll allow you to answer the same question.
I am not, or same as the director.
And as has been indicated here, and look, again, that's not a criticism. It's just the human endeavor. We sometimes make mistakes, as do agencies sometimes make mistakes, and all of us can think of examples of that, including meaningful mistakes, by the way, mistakes that had clear implications for our policy. And as has been indicated here as well, there's a difference in level of confidence. Mr. Comey, you have a higher degree of confidence in this report than you do, don't you, Mr. Rogers?
To be specific, a different level of content on one specific assessment or judgment.
Understand.
But a concurrence overall in that judgment.
But that one judgment, that one is a very important part of this report. And if I could make just this last point, and this is an important point, I think, and that is the difficulty of determining motive. I mean, we can go back, we can look at facts, we can look at what happened, we can often determine who did it, who they did it with, when they did it, but to determine motive, you've got to crawl inside someone's head. And that's much, much more difficult. In fact, quoting from the preamble in this report, talking about a leader's intentions, it says, this objective is difficult to achieve when seeking to understand complex issues in which foreign actors go to extraordinary lengths to hide and to obfuscate their activities. Once again, we're trying to determine motive, which is very difficult. Do you agree with that determining motive is one of the most difficult challenges when it comes to an intelligence analysis?
I do, Mr. Stewart. And I should emphasize something that Admiral Rogers said earlier. We made no judgment on whether the Russians were successful in any way in having an impact on the election. I just want to be clear. That's not in the report because we didn't opine on it. We didn't. That's not within our
I understand that, but we're looking at Russian activities, and we're making a conclusion of why they did that. In this case,
Sure.
that they preferred one candidate over the other. I was in Moscow last August. I came home and I did some media interviews and talked to some folks, and I said, they're going to mess with our elections. And that wasn't based on any intelligence analysts or specific information. It was just based on history. We knew that they would. And I was always asked, well, who do they want to win? And I said then, I don't think they care. I don't think they, could believe they could determine who would win. And others, as we've said here a number of times, they just want to break down the foundation. They just want to break the trust in our institutions. They want to take away that faith we have in our electoral process. And by the way, the intelligence community agreed with us, with me on that analysis, for a long, long time, up until December. And then suddenly they didn't. And that was when the president asked for this report, and he asked for it to be concluded very quickly, and then the analysis changed entirely. And it went from, no, they don't really care, to, no, they want Mr. Trump to win. And I think there's another plausible explanation, which is what I want to talk about in the few minutes I have remaining. Let me begin by asking you, do you think that the Russians expected Secretary Clinton to win the election?
Yes, as of August, certainly. August, September.
Okay, Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Comey, you indicated as of August, September. Do you believe they ever came to a conclusion that, you know what, Mr. Trump's going to win?
No, the assessment of the intelligence community was that early on, they thought he might have a shot. And so they wanted to mess with our election, hurt our country in general. That's always the baseline. They hated her, Secretary Clinton, wanted to harm her, and thought it might have a chance to help Mr. Trump, and then later concluded that Mr. Trump was hopeless, and they would focus then on just trying to undermine Secretary Clinton, especially with the European allies.
I got that. So up until summer and through the fall, they believed that Secretary Clinton would win. Is that true?
I think the assessment was late in the summer, they concluded, based on the polling I think a lot of people were reading, that Mr. Trump didn't have a chance, and they shifted to just focusing on just trying to undermine her.
And I tell you, if you were to tell me, and I know you didn't, but I'm just saying, if anyone were to tell me that they concluded Mr. Trump was going to win, I'd just say they're nuts. because there was no one in the world who thought that. Every media organization, every political organization, every government organization that I'm familiar with last fall thought that Secretary Clinton would be the next president of the United States.
I think the Russians agreed.
I absolutely did agree. Then this is the point, and this is such a fine line, but it's such an important point. And that is, how can you know for certainty if the Russians were motivated by hurting the person that they thought, in fact, fully expected was going to be the next president of the United States, and comparing that with a motive of this kind of a Hail Mary pass, you know what, maybe this guy's got a shot, let's try and help him get elected. Because those motives would be, and that's again, coming back to my original point, determining motives is very difficult. You have to either have very direct information, or you have to be able to get inside someone's head and really figure out what it is that's driving them. And knowing the Russians expected Secretary Clinton to win, would you see that some of those things that they've done would be consistent with undermining her presidency, not necessarily because they thought Mr. Trump was going to win and they wanted to help him?
Again, I think it's two closely related sides of the same coin. I mean, to put it in a homely metaphor, I hate the New England Patriots. And no matter who they play, I'd like them to lose. And so I'm at the same time rooting against the Patriots and hoping their opponent beats them, because there's only two teams on the field. But what the intelligence community concluded was, early on, the hatred for Mrs. Clinton was all the way along.
Yep.
When Mr. Trump became the nominee, there was some sense that it'd be great if he could win, it'd be great if we could help him, but we need to hurt her no matter what. And then it shifted to, he has no chance, so let's just focus on undermining her. That was the judgment of the intelligence community.
Well, I'd also, if I could highlight, I acknowledge the challenge at times about trying to understand intent. But the level of, we're not going to go into specifics in an open, unclassified form, but the level of sourcing, the multiple sources we had, which were able to independently corroborate the judgment. And there's a reason why we were high confidence in everything except just one issue, to include the intent.
I understand. I spent some time out at the CIA last week. I was with the staff as best we could through the 2,000 some odd pages. And by the way, not many people did. And some people are casting, aspersions in and not making the effort to go out there and actually look at that. But I'm telling you that having done that, I think a reasonable person could say what I've said here today, that there is another element to this, that there is another, as you said, Mr. Comey, another side of the coin. And this is a very, very difficult, in my opinion, thing to say with high levels of confidence, which is why, once again, the intelligence community isn't perfect sometimes. And we do make mistakes. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I'd like to come back for just a few minutes if we could after.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Schiff's recognized.
Thank you. Just a couple of quick follow-up questions by myself and Mr. Himes, and then we'll go to Mr. Castro. Director, you were asked about Director Clapper's comments, and I think your response indicated that they were correct as far as the unclassified intelligence assessment goes.
Yeah, that's what I understood the question to be about the report itself.
I want to make it clear to people, though, the intelligence assessment, the unclassified intelligence assessment, doesn't discuss the issue of U.S. person coordination with the Russians, and I assume that's because at the time of the report in January of this year, that was under an investigation that you have now disclosed. Is that right?
Correct. The counterintelligence investigation is the FBI's business. The IC report was about what the intelligence community had about what Russia had done. So there is nothing in the report about coordination or anything like that. It's a separate responsibility of the FBI to try and understand that, investigate it, and assess it.
So we shouldn't read Mr. Clapper's comments as suggesting that he takes a different view of whether you had sufficiently credible information and evidence to initiate a FBI counterintelligence investigation.
I don't know exactly what he meant. All I can say is what the fact is, which is we just laid out. There's the report, and then there's our investigation.
And the report doesn't cover the investigation.
Correct.
Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. Gentlemen, in my original questions to you, I asked you whether the intelligence community had undertaken any sort of study to determine whether Russian interference had had any influence on the electoral process, and I think you told me the answer was no.
Correct.
Correct. We said the U.S. intelligence community does not do analysis or reporting on the U.S. political process or U.S. public opinion. That is
Okay.
not our fault.
So thanks to the modern technology that's in front of me right here, I've got a tweet from the president an hour ago saying the NSA and FBI tell Congress that Russia did not influence the electoral process. So that's not quite accurate, that tweet.
I'm sorry, I haven't been following anybody on Twitter while I've been sitting here.
I can read it to you. It says the NSA and FBI tell Congress that Russia did not influence the electoral process. This tweet has gone out to millions of Americans, 16.1 million to be exact. Is the tweet, as I read it to you, the NSA and FBI tell Congress that Russia did not influence the electoral process, is that accurate?
Well, it's hard for me to react to that. Let me just tell you what we understand the state of what we've said is. We've offered no opinion, have no view, have no information on potential impact because it's never something that we looked at.
Okay. So it's not too far of a logical leap to conclude that the assertion that you have told the Congress that there was no influence on the electoral process is not quite right.
Right. It certainly wasn't our intention to say that today because we don't have any information on that subject. And that's not something that was looked at.
Right.
Admiral Rogers, before I yield back to the ranking member, there's another tweet that says NSA Director Rogers tells Congress unmasking individuals endangers national security. My understanding was, as a member of the committee, that there is a lengthy and very specific process for the unmasking, but that it does not inherently and of itself endanger national security.
I assume the comment is designed to address the leaking of such information. But again, I have not read what you're saying to me, so I'm not in a position to comment on it, sir.
Thank you. I'll yield back to the ranking member.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, for your service to the nation and for your testimony today. I want to take a moment to turn to the Christopher Steele dossier, which was first mentioned in the media just before the election and published in full by media outlets in January. My focus today is to explore how many claims within Steele's dossier are looking more and more likely as though they are accurate. First, let me ask you, can you describe who Christopher Steele is?
No, I'm not going to comment on that.
Are you investigating the claims made in the dossier?
Not going to comment on that, Mr. Castro.
Okay. Well, the reputation of the author, Christopher Steele, as a former accomplished British intelligence officer with a career built on following Russia is important. This is not someone who doesn't know how to run a source and not someone without contacts. The allegations it raises about President Trump's campaign aides' connections to Russians, when overlaid with known established facts and timelines from the 2016 campaign, are very revealing. So let's begin. In general, as my colleagues have discussed before, is it true that a large number of oligarchs and wealthy businessmen in Russia have profited from their continuing close relationships or cooperation with the Kremlin?
Could you say that one more time, sir?
Sure.
I want to make sure I understand.
Have oligarchs and wealthy folks in Russia profited from their connection to the Kremlin?
Yes.
And there are no free lunches in Russia. If you get wealthy under Putin, it's because you support Putin and are expected to support him. Is that fair to say?
I would assume there's a perception of advantage, but I would assume it also varies by the specifics of the particular individual and relationship we're talking about.
Okay. But Putin never just trusts, he verifies, right? As a former KGB man, he wants to keep tabs on his wealthiest citizens, especially those that could ever pose a challenge to him. Is that right?
Keep it in this? You want to keep it?
I assume he maintains knowledge of the situation around him to include particular centers of influence within Russia.
Thank you. So is it likely that the Kremlin would accept or actively trade favors or other valuable or sensitive information, intelligence from foreign figures about Russian oligarchs or wealthy businessmen living abroad?
Is it possible? Yes, but again, it depends on the particulars of the situation. I don't know that I would make a flat statement on that.
But it's certainly a possibility.
It's a possibility?
Okay. Well, the dossier definitely seems right on these points. A quid pro quo relationship seems to exist between the Trump campaign and Putin's Russia. A July 19, 2016 entry, for example, asserts that Russians were receiving intel from Trump's team on Russian oligarchs and their families in the United States. An entry from June 20th, 2016 states, quote, Trump and his inner circle have accepted regular flow of intelligence from the Kremlin, including on his Democratic and other political rivals, unquote, which is something for something. A July 30th entry likewise states that, quote, a source close to the Trump campaign confirms regular exchange with the Kremlin has existed for at least 8 years, including intelligence fed back to Russia on oligarchs' activities in the United States. Is it generally true that Moscow actively seeks and supports, whether through the oligarchs, overt Russian officials, or undeclared intelligence officers, sympathetic or cooperative foreign figures abroad, whether through business dealings or political backing or a combination of the two?
I think it's generally true.
I mean, generally, this is a tactic. Generally, it's a tactic we have seen over time, but again, I would caution us, we're talking about very specific cases theoretically here, and I'm not prepared to get in any of the specifics.
And I know that my colleagues have touched upon this, but I think it's important in the context of Christopher Steele's dossier to bring it up again. So my question is it likely or plausible that the Russians might seek out Americans for Moscow's purposes?
It is one of the focuses of our counterintelligence mission to try to understand the ways in which they try to do that. That's at the core of their intelligence gathering, is try and co-opt, recruit Americans to give them information.
So the dossier states in an entry dated August 10, 2016, that a, quote, Kremlin official involved in U.S. relations, unquote, suggests that Moscow might offer assistance to, quote, sympathetic U.S. actors. Does this sound like a plausible tactic out of the Russian playbook?
I'm not going to comment on that, Mr. Castro.
Okay. Now, let's get even more specific. Among the U.S. actors, this Kremlin official mentions are Carter Page and Michael Flynn, whom my colleagues have already discussed at length and which the dossier describes as, quote, examples of successes by the Kremlin official. We know Carter Page went to Moscow on July 7th to give a speech to the new economic school. We're in possession of the slide deck from his speech there. And we know Carter Page obtained approval from the Trump campaign manager at the time, Corey Lewandowski, as reported in Politico, citing National Security Campaign official J.D. Gordon. Now, let me ask you another question with respect to somebody else. Is it correct that Igor Senchin, the president of Russian oil giant Rosneft, is a former member of Russian intelligence and a longtime aide and confidant to Vladimir Putin?
Not going to answer that, Mr. Castro.
In an October 18, 2016 entry, the dossier states that during Page's visit to Moscow, he met with Igor Senchin, offering, quote, Page and Trump's associate the brokerage of up to 19% stake in Rosneft, with Page confirming that, quote, if Trump were elected U.S. president, sanctions on Russia would be lifted. And although, fortunately, the White House hasn't been so naive as to unilaterally lift sanctions on Russia, it was widely reported that on January 27th of this year, Rosneft sold a 19.5% stake in Rosneft in what Reuters calls, quote, one of its biggest privatizations since the 1990s. Furthermore, Reuters reported that, quote, public records show the ownership structure of the stake ultimately includes a Cayman Islands company whose beneficial owners cannot be traced. What a coincidence. Is this the subject of your investigation? One of the subjects of your investigation?
Same answer.
Okay.
Meaning I'm not going to comment.
I understand. So let's move to WikiLeaks for a moment, who played such a prominent role in the 2016 election. As has been established before and reestablished at this hearing, WikiLeaks was at a minimum an unwitting pawn and at maximum an active co-conspirator of the Kremlin's in publishing stolen DNC and senior Democratic officials' emails. And do you agree this was done in order to offer Moscow some measure of separation as to mask its hand in having hacked and stolen the data in the first place, but so it could still have it publicly posted to inflict damage on the Clinton campaign?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yes.
Okay. An entry from July 19, 2016 in the dossier states that a Trump associate knew that the Kremlin was using WikiLeaks in order to maintain, quote, plausible deniability of its involvement. 3 days after this entry, WikiLeaks carries out the Kremlin's wishes and publishes upwards of 20,000 stolen DNC emails and 8,000 associated email attachments. And the rest, as they say, is history. Another entry, dated August 17th, has Carter Page and a Russian associate discussing WikiLeaks publishing emails in order to swing Sanders supporters away from Clinton and to Trump. And again, from a September 14th entry of the dossier, quote, Kremlin has further compromising material on Clinton in form of emails and considers disseminating after parliamentary elections in late September. And on October 7th, WikiLeaks publishes John Podesta's hacked emails. So the coincidences keep piling up. Let's turn, in the few minutes that I have remaining, again to Paul Manafort as a follow-up to Mr. Himes' questioning. Suffice it to say, Paul Manafort was a major part of the Trump campaign, including serving as its chairman, convention manager, and chief strategist before departing the campaign in disgrace in August 2016. It's also established the fact that Paul Manafort was a longtime official advisor to pro-Russian Ukrainian political leadership. Is Paul Manafort a subject in your investigation?
I'm not going to comment on that.
All right. Director, can you describe to the American people the Russian concept of kompromat?
It's a technique that they use to gather information on people that may be embarrassing or humiliating and using it to coerce cooperation.
In your career, have you known instances where that has been successfully leveraged?
Yes, I believe our counterintelligence division has encountered it a number of times.
Does that include private places, including places such as hotels that are wired for audio and video?
I don't think I remember enough about the particulars to say, but in theory, sure.
Thank you. I yield back. I yield back to Ranking Member Schiff.
I recognize Mr. Heck.
Admiral Rogers, before I get into my main body of my remarks, I want to go back to your earlier comment about that there is no evidence to indicate that there was a successful Russian hacking of voter results or tabulations. What I did not hear you say is whether or not there had been any attempts to hack into election systems of any kind.
Yeah. I can answer that because the FBI's responsibility is in the United States. We saw no indication of that. We saw efforts to penetrate voter registration databases, state boards of elections at that level. We saw no efforts aimed at the vote itself.
But you did see efforts to penetrate registration rolls?
Correct.
Did you see efforts to penetrate any other portions of election systems other than registrations? In this country, it's a highly decentralized system. And as a consequence, as you will recall, then Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson indicated that election systems should become a part of our critical infrastructure for cybersecurity purposes.
Their efforts were aimed at the voter registration systems in various states, and it takes different forms in various states. Sometimes there's a private vendor, sometimes it's state, but that's where it was focused and not on the vote itself, vote machines, vote tabulation, vote transmission that we've seen.
Thank you. I yield back to the ranking member, I think.
Time's expired, and let me go quickly to Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's been a lot of statements that have been made up here as opposed to questions, and we don't certainly feel the need to clarify all of them, but there is one aspect that does need to be clarified because it's also involved both of your testimonies. There has been discussion up here concerning the statements by James Clapper, and rather than do the conjecture as it has been made, I'm going to just read it. Chuck Todd said, "Let me ask you this. Does intelligence exist that can definitively answer the following question, whether there were improper contacts between the Trump campaign and Russian officials?" James Clapper said, "We do not include any evidence in our report. I say our, that's NSA, FBI, and CIA, with my office and the Director of National Intelligence, that had any reflection of collusion between members of the Trump campaign and the Russians. There was no evidence of that included in our report." Chuck Todd followed up, "I understand that, but does it exist?" James Clapper answered, "Not to my knowledge." So the text is not merely related to the report. I yield back.
Mr. Crawford's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. I'll start with Director Comey. Despite your expressed disdain for the New England Patriots, I think that Tom Brady would probably like to express his gratitude for the FBI's assistance in recovering his stolen Super Bowl jersey, so I'll do that on his behalf now.
Thank you. By the way, if I'm honest with myself, the reason I don't like the Patriots is they represent sustained excellence. And as a Giants fan, that drives me crazy.
Director Comey, are you familiar with an article, July 18th, 2016, from the Washington Post entitled "Trump Campaign Guts GOP's Anti-Russia Stance on Ukraine"?
I'm not familiar with that article. I don't remember it.
Ask unanimous consent to add this to the record. Just for your edification, Director, there's an allegation contained in that article that as a National Security Committee platform meeting, Trump staffers wrote an amendment to an amendment that stripped out platforms call for providing, quote, lethal defensive weapons and replace it with softer language calling for, quote, appropriate assistance. Are you familiar with a March 18th, 2017 story in the Washington Examiner entitled "How Pundits Got Key Parts of the Trump-Russia Story All Wrong"? Are you familiar with that?
I don't think I am.
I'd ask unanimous consent to add that to the record. And also for your edification, I'll go to some of the meat of that story. Are you aware of an allegation that Trump staffers gutted the Ukraine plank of the platform?
Am I aware of the article on that?
Are you aware of anything to that nature, the article, or any activity to that end?
I don't want to talk about anything. I'm willing to comment on whether I've seen different things in the media. I don't want to talk about anything beyond that.
Okay. So then, safe to say you're not aware of the final platform that retained all of the language from the original platform plus a portion of the amendment offered by the platform committee member?
I don't want to comment.
Okay. Then I'll go through. I know that you're limited on what you can comment on. I'll go through some of the as I said, the meat of this. Reading from the platform, it says, quote, "We will meet the return of Russian belligerents with the same resolve that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. We will not accept any territorial change in Eastern Europe imposed by force in Ukraine or elsewhere, and will use all appropriate measures to bring to justice the practitioners of aggression and assassination," end quote. Does that sound to you as like a pro-Russian or a pro-Putin statement in your assessment?
That's not for me to comment on.
Okay. Further, in the platform, it says, quote, "We support maintaining and, if warranted, increasing sanctions together with our allies against Russia unless and until Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity are fully restored. We also support providing appropriate assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine and greater coordination with NATO defense planning." And again, that sounds like fairly clear language in their relationship to Russia. Would you agree?
Same answer, Mr. Crawford.
Okay, thank you. The final language I'll get to here in just a sec. There was an amendment, but the final language regarding that plank of the platform with regard to national security relating to Russia. It says, quote, "We support maintaining and, if warranted, increasing sanctions together with our allies against Russia unless and until Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity are fully restored. We also support providing appropriate assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine and greater coordination with NATO defense planning." And again, to me, that sounds fairly clear and straightforward that is not conducive to a Putin administration. Would you agree?
I'll give you the same answer, Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, sir. It's also important to note that that platform was adopted in coordination with and in concert with the Trump administration as they met at the convention and they went through the platform process. The Trump campaign agreed to the platform condemning Kremlin belligerents, calling for continued and perhaps increased sanctions against Russia, as I indicated in the text of that platform, for the full restoration of Ukrainian territory, for refusing to accept, quote, "any territorial change in Eastern Europe imposed by force in Ukraine or elsewhere," and pledging to aid Ukraine's armed forces. So I bring that up just to highlight and note the fact that none of that appears to be pro-Putin or pro-Russia language.
Mr. Crawford, will you yield back to me? So Mr. Comey, I just want to make sure, I know you're not going to comment on this, but I hope that you'll take this back to your investigators, because there seems to be the line out there that somehow the Republican Party watered down its platform. And that's not true. That didn't happen. And in fact, what happened is that the platform was actually increased increased its certainty and against what the Russians were up to, and it actually amended the platform to make it stronger than what it initially was. So, I know there's a lot of circumstantial evidence out there about all these supposed people that knew the Russians, but the reality is, and remains the case, the Republican Party had a very strong platform that was against the Russians, and it was increased in its strength, not decreased like has been reported. So I know that you won't comment, but I hope that at least you will provide this to your investigative team so that we can at least get this off the table. Will you take this
Sure.
back? Okay, we'll get it to you. Sorry, Mr. Crawford, we'll go back.
Oh, not at all. Thank you, Mr. Comey. I appreciate that. Admiral Rogers, would you like to make a comment about the New England Patriots before I move forward?
I'm a Chicago Bears guy, born and bred.
Right. Admiral, our employees, you mentioned this before, but I just want to go through this list. Are employees of intelligence community agencies required to disclose visits with foreign nationals?
Yes, broadly, although I'll be the first to admit not all foreign national interactions are the same. Interactions with the British, for example, are in a very different place than other countries, for example.
Okay, appreciate that clarification. To your knowledge, are elected officials required to disclose contact with foreign nationals?
I don't know what the specifics are across the federal government, because clearly in many jobs, interaction with foreign counterparts is part of your job. I'm the first to acknowledge that. I interact with foreign counterparts, as does Director Comey, regularly in the course of our duties.
Are federal campaign employees required to disclose contacts with foreign nationals, to your knowledge?
I apologize, I just don't know.
Okay. Are private citizens required in any way to disclose or to report contact with foreign nationals?
I don't know.
Is it customary for transition teams for a presidential campaign, for transition team members to meet with foreign nationals, to your knowledge? Is that customary?
It's an area I just don't have any knowledge on.
Is it unusual?
I don't have any knowledge on it.
Has
I
it happened
apologize.
before?
I've never been part of a transition team. I don't know.
Are transition team members required by law to disclose contact with foreign nationals?
I apologize. I don't know the law there.
Thank you. I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. Ms. Stefanik's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Comey and Admiral Rogers, for your testimony today. My first set of questions are directed at Director Comey. Broadly, when the FBI has any open counterintelligence investigation, what are the typical protocols or procedures for notifying the DNI, the White House, and senior congressional leadership?
There is a practice of a quarterly briefing on sensitive cases to the chair and ranking of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. And the reason I hesitate is, thanks to feedback we've gotten, we're trying to make it better. And that involves a briefing of the Department of Justice, I believe the DNI, and some portion of the National Security Council at the White House.
So if that's
So
quarterly,
to brief them before Congress is briefed.
so it's quarterly for all three, then senior congressional leadership, the White House, and the DNI?
I think that's right. Now, that's by practice, not by rule or by written policy, which is why, thanks to the chair and ranking giving us feedback, we're trying to tweak it in certain ways.
So since in your opening statement you confirmed that there is a counterintelligence investigation currently open, and you also referenced that it started in July, when did you notify the DNI, the White House, or senior congressional leadership?
It's a good question. Congressional leadership, sometime recently, they were briefed on the nature of the investigation in some detail, as I said. Obviously, the Department of Justice has been aware of it all along. The DNI, I don't know what the DNI's knowledge of it was, because we didn't have a DNI until Mr. Coates took office, and I briefed him his first morning in office.
So just to drill down on this, if the open investigation began in July and the briefing of congressional leadership only occurred recently, why was there no notification prior to the past month?
I think our decision was it was a matter of such sensitivity that we wouldn't include it in the quarterly briefings.
So when you state our decision, is that your decision? Is that usually your decision what gets briefed in those quarterly updates?
No, it's usually the decision of the head of our counterintelligence division.
And just, again, to get the detailed on the record, why was the decision made not to brief senior congressional leadership until recently, when the investigation had been open since July, a very serious investigation? Why was that decision made to wait months?
I think because of the sensitivity of the matter.
Stepping back more broadly, in the case of Russia, we know that cyber hacking is just one tactic that's typically part of a broader influence or information warfare campaign. And we know the Russian government is ready and willing to employ hacking as but one of many tools in their toolkit to obtain information for use against the United States. Is there any evidence that Russia tried to hack other entities associated with the 2016 presidential campaign in addition to the DNC or Clinton campaign operatives?
Yes, many others.
Can you specify those others? Did that include the RNC? Did that include any of the other campaigns of candidates in the primaries, either Democrats or Republicans?
I think what we can say in an unclassified setting is what we have in the report, that there were efforts to penetrate organizations associated with the Republican Party, and that, I think that's what we said in the report, and that there were not releases of material hacked from any Republican-associated organizations.
But the hacking, the use of cyber tools as part of their broader, whether you call it hybrid warfare or information warfare campaigns, it was done to both parties.
Correct.
Thank you. Taking a further step back of what's been in the news recently, and I'm referring to the Yahoo hack, the Yahoo data breach. Last week, the Department of Justice announced that it was charging hackers with ties to the FSB in the 2014 Yahoo data breach. Was this hack done, to your knowledge, for intelligence purposes?
I can't say in this forum.
Press reporting indicates that Yahoo hacked targeted journalists, dissidents, and government officials. Do you know what the FSB did with the information they obtained?
Same answer.
Okay, I understand that. How did the administration determine who to sanction as part of the election hacking? How familiar are you with that decision process, and how is that determination made?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with the decision process. The FBI has a factual input, but I don't recall, I don't have any personal knowledge of how the decisions were made about who to sanction.
Looking forward, and this is for both of you, what is the NSA and the FBI doing to keep Americans safe, to keep campaign entities, to keep any entity associated with a major campaign safe from aggressive Russia cyber measures that were utilized in this past election?
So we continue to maximize the insights we're generating about activity. For example, this started with NSA initially gaining access in the summer of 15. We became aware of that activity, shared it with our FBI teammates. That continues. We try to make sure that the insights we generate are shared with our law enforcement teammates who then interact with the private sector. We're trying to work broadly across the U.S. government to increase cybersecurity, as you heard discuss, ongoing discussions about what's the role of the voting infrastructure in the United States in terms of critical infrastructure. Do we need to bring that within the critical infrastructure framework? I know that topic has been ongoing for some period of time.
And Director Comey?
Yeah, I think that's right. And just making sure that we are sharing information when we get it, that someone's being hit, but more importantly, that we're showing people what we've learned from this cycle so they can tighten up.
Thank you. It seems to me, in my first line of questioning, the more serious a counterintelligence investigation is, that would seem to trigger the need to update not just the White House, the DNI, but also senior congressional leadership. And you stated it was due to the severity. I think moving forward, it seems that the most severe and serious investigations should be notified to senior congressional leadership. And with that, thanks for the lenience, Chairman. I yield back.
That's good feedback, Ms. Stefanik. The challenge for us is sometimes we want to keep it tight within the executive branch, and if we're going to go brief congressional leaders, the practice has been then we brief inside the executive branch, and so we have to figure out how to navigate that in a good way.
We may have to update the law on that. Generally yields back. Mr. Schiff is recognized for 15 minutes, and I think then we'll come back to our side for 15, and that should be it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple questions before I hand it back to Mr. Heck. Do the Russians favor the United States' provision of lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine? Admiral?
No.
They would strongly oppose such an idea, would they not?
They have been opposed to it to date.
And I can tell you that the idea of providing lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine has bipartisan support here on the Hill, including Senator McCain, certainly myself, I would imagine many members of this committee. There was an effort at the convention to strengthen the platform by including a provision that would provide lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine. That was defeated. The campaign manager for the Trump campaign at the time, Paul Manafort, denied that the campaign was involved in defeating that amendment. But the delegate who offered the amendment later disclosed to the press that, in fact, it was dropped at the insistence of the Trump campaign. J.D. Gordon, a national security advisor for the Trump campaign, was forced later to admit that, in fact, he had weighed in against the amendment that would have provided that the U.S. should give lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine. So I would join my chairman in asking you to look into this, particularly since we know that Ambassador Kislyak attended the convention, and if there was any communication between the Russians and the Trump campaign that had the effect, any coordination that resulted in the defeat of an amendment that was against Russian interest, the committee would certainly like to know, and we welcome that inquiry. Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Ranking Member. There are a lot of emotions kicking around in this room today. I've perceived anger and outrage and subdued somberness. The one I feel overwhelmingly is sadness. We've heard nothing but terribly disturbing evidence of what has happened to our country at the hands of arguably our greatest adversary. And what's worse, the evidence we've heard so far all seems to lead to the conclusion that they had help from the inside, that this was in part an inside job from U.S. persons, willing American accomplices, or terribly naive ones, or probably both, who helped the Russians attack our country and our democracy. We're both still at the early stages of our investigation. We're not indicting anyone. We're merely laying out some of the evidence and the facts, dirty though they be, sleazy though they be. And no matter what, we can safely conclude at this point that never in the modern era has a president and his administration had so many foreign entanglements that continue to push American foreign policy away from its core roots, beliefs, interests, and alliances towards unprecedented positions that only Putin himself could approve of. How else can we explain the modification to the Republican Party platform in such a decidedly pro-Russian way? Republicans who are always so strong against geopolitical foes like Russia. I know my colleagues on this committee take the Russia threat very seriously. Why wouldn't the people who inhabit the White House? How else can we explain an administration that beats up our oldest allies, like Australia and Britain, and our strongest and most sacrosanct alliance, like NATO, but never, ever say a bad word about Putin? In fact, they say a lot of good words about Putin. An administration that, we have heard decisively, makes up baseless wiretapping charges against a former United States president, equates our intelligence agencies to Nazi Germany, and argues moral equivalence between a repressive authoritarian states with an abhorrent human rights record like Russia and our free and open democracy. And yet, this administration never, ever utters any criticism of Russia. Let's be clear, though. This is not about party. It's not about relitigating the election. It's not as if anything we do here will put a president from a different political party in the Oval Office. So I hope that it's clear that it's about something much more important. And no, it's not about political motivation, to my friend who said and suggested that earlier. This is about patriotism, about something way more important than party. This is about country and the very heart of what this country is built on, which is open, free, fair, trusted elections. We don't take our investigation lightly, and I know you don't. Indeed, you go through a process to even decide to do that, whether to expend the resources, to begin with credible allegations and reason to believe that there is something that warrants it. And I no doubt believe that you have talked to lawyers in and out of the prosecution divisions about whether or not this warrants an investigation. I know you don't take this lightly. But what we have seen is damning evidence today of what Russia did. We've also seen damning evidence of how they did it. Russia has a history of using active measures, many of which we have heard about today. Let's recap them. We're getting near the end. Hacking and dumping information to damage or embarrass their enemies. We heard about this, of course, with respect to WikiLeaks and Guccifer 2.0. Using third parties and cutouts, business people, oligarchs, and other ostensibly private individuals to cultivate relationships. We've discussed Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, Rosneft CEO Igor Sechin, and of course, Vladimir Putin himself. We've also heard about Russia's use of companies like Gazprom, the Bank of Cyprus, Rosneft, and a confusing web of offshore shell companies used, it would seem, to hide or to launder money. We've also heard how Russia released disinformation to spread rumors and confuse the public and sow distrust in the ability to even know truth objectively, using propaganda media outlets, whether directly owned by Russia or not, to release such disinformation in order to claim plausible deniability of Russia's hands. Here again, we see WikiLeaks and Guccifer 2.0, but we also see the use of propaganda outlets like RT. And, of course, the use of U.S. persons of influence, whether through active collusion or coordination or naive acquiescence. We don't yet know the full extent to further Russia's attempts to undermine our elections and ultimately weaken our democracy. On that last point, we've heard about quite a few individuals in the Trump orbit who fell somewhere on that spectrum from mere naivete, disturbing enough if this naivete is a feature of those who are supposed to be running our country in foreign policy, to unwitting Russian dupes, to willing blindness to active coordination. This rogues galleries includes those already fired: Roger Stone, advisor to Donald Trump; Paul Manafort, advisor to Donald Trump; Michael Flynn, national security advisor to Donald Trump; Carter Page, advisor to Donald Trump. But the cloud of deep suspicion and Russian entanglements extends to those still in power. Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State to Donald Trump; Michael Caputo, advisor to Donald Trump; Jeff Sessions, Attorney General for Donald Trump, and members of the Trump family itself. This matters. It's serious. Our battleships weren't sunk and our towers didn't collapse a la 2011. But make no mistake, 2016 is a year that we should mark on our calendars. And it's still going on. The attack didn't end on Election Day. And it will continue, as you have suggested, unless we, all of us in this room, stop it. Admiral Rogers, you've proudly worn that uniform your entire career. I am proud of your service and grateful for it. But I would ask you, sir, not even with respect to this specific investigation, to use your own words, as someone who no doubt has been in theater, who's lost brothers and sisters in combat, to explain to me, but more importantly to the American people. Don't assume they know the answer. Tell them in your words why we should care about Russia's active measures campaign aimed at destabilizing our democracy and that of our allies. In your words, sir, why should they care?
I don't think it's in the best interest of our nation for any external entity to attempt to manipulate outcomes, to shape choices. That should be the inherent role of a democracy. The investigation we're going through, I think, is a positive in the sense that it'll help illuminate to all of us, regardless of party, what are the implications here and what does it mean for us? Because I think our conclusion and that of the intelligence community broadly here is this, absent some change, this behavior is not likely to stop. Absent some change in the dynamic, this is not likely to be the last time we'll be having these discussions about this kind of activity. And I don't think that's in anybody's best interest for us as a nation.
Director Comey, parallel question. Again, in general terms, and not with respect to the specific investigation you have revealed here today. Not asking you to go into specifics on any individuals, but please explain briefly to me, and more importantly to the American public, why we should care about Russia's use of U.S. persons, of Americans, helping Russia destabilize our democracy.
Well, like Admiral Rogers, I truly believe we are a shining city on a hill, to quote a great American, and one of the things we radiate to the world is the importance of our wonderful, often messy, but free and fair democratic system and the elections that undergird it. And so when there's an effort by a foreign nation state to mess with that, to destroy that, to corrupt that, it's very, very serious, threatens what is America. And if any Americans are part of that effort, it's a very serious matter. And so you would expect the FBI to want to understand, is that so? And if so, who did what? But again, I want to be very careful that people don't overinterpret my words. To preserve our ability to answer those questions, we're not talking about our work. I'm not here voluntarily, right? I would rather not be talking about this at all. But we thought it was important to share at least that much with the committee and the American people, and now we're going to close our mouths and do our work to see if we can answer those questions, because the answers matter.
They do indeed. I thank you both for those answers, and I thank you both for your service to our country. I would like to think that we can turn this from a sad event into a positive one. This country has stood up and fought on behalf of its own health and welfare and that of its citizens, and met any number of challenges throughout our nation's history. The worst thing we could do is underestimate the nature of this challenge before us today. With that, Ranking Member, I would appreciate it if I could yield to my friend from Texas, Mr. Castro, briefly.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you. One more question with respect to leaks. I know that's been a big topic of the line of questioning, and of course is of concern to all of us, regardless of political party. But I want to ask you, Director, is it possible that some of those leaks could come from not the intelligence community, but from members of the White House staff, for example?
Sure, it could come from lots of different places. And it's often one of the things that's challenging, as I said, about a leak investigation. You think it's going to be a small circle, but it turns out a lot of people either knew about it or heard echoes of it and had stories to tell to journalists about it. So in my experience trying to figure these things out for decades, it's often coming from places you didn't anticipate.
No, and the reason I asked the question is because the President has berated the FBI and the intelligence community on the issue of leaks, and others have berated the intelligence community and the press because of these leaks. But I think it's worth considering that it's quite possible that there are folks who have a kind of political Munchausen by proxy syndrome where they leak information because they want to be the savior once it blows up. There are all sorts of individuals that serve on political staffs, and I think that we ought to consider the possibility that perhaps it is somebody at the White House. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, we yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you all for being here, and thank you for your continued service to your country. I've learned recently the value of sitting in one place for a long period of time and listening, and today has added to that understanding. And I'm going to try to ask questions that y'all can answer in this format and are within your areas of expertise. And Director Rogers, my first question to you, the exploit that was used by the Russians to penetrate the DNC? Was it sophisticated? Was it a zero-day exploit? A zero-day being some type of, for those that are watching, an exploit that has never been used before?
In an open classified form, I am not going to talk about Russian tactics, techniques, or procedures about how they executed their hacks.
If members of the DNC had not, let me rephrase this, can we talk about spear phishing?
Sure, in general terms, yes, sir.
Spear phishing is when somebody sends an email and somebody clicks on something in that email.
The user thinks they're receiving an email either of interest or from a legitimate user. They open it up and they'll often click, if you will, on a link, an attachment.
Was that type of tactic used in the...
Again, I'm not in an unclassified form, just not going to
copy. I apologize. Director Comey, when was the first time the FBI notified the DNC of the hack? Roughly.
I think August of 2015.
And was that prior to any of the information being leaked, to being sent on, put on WikiLeaks?
Yes, the first Russian-directed releases were middle of June of the next year by DC Leaks and this Guccifer 2.0 persona, and then that was followed by WikiLeaks. So about a year, a little less than a year earlier.
So there was about a year between the FBI's first notification of some potential problems with the DNC network and then that information getting on WikiLeaks.
Yes.
Have you been able to, when did the DNC provide access to the FBI for your technical folks to review what happened?
Well, we never got direct access to the machines themselves. The DNC in the spring of 2016 hired a firm that ultimately shared with us their forensics from their review of the system.
Director Rogers, did the NSA ever get access to the DNC hardware?
The NSA didn't ask for access. That's not in our job jar. That would
Good copy. So, Director, FBI notified the DNC early, before any information was put on WikiLeaks, and when you have still never been given access to any of the technical or the physical machines that were hacked by the Russians.
That's correct, although we got the forensics from the pros that they hired, which, again, best practice is always to get access to the machines themselves, but this, my folks tell me, was an appropriate substitute.
At what point did the company the DNC use share that forensic information to you?
I don't remember for sure. I think June. I could be wrong about that.
The company went public in June of 16 with their conclusions, I would assume.
Yeah, I think it was about the time. I think it was a little bit before the announcement, but I'll say approximately June.
So that was how long after the first notification that the FBI did of the DNC?
10 months.
10 months. So the FBI notified the DNC of the hack, and it was not until 10 months later that you had any details about what was actually going on forensically on their network.
That's correct. Assuming I have the dates about right, but it was some months later.
Knowing what we know now, would the FBI have done anything different in trying to notify the DNC of what happened?
Oh, sure.
What measures would you have done differently?
We'd have sent up a much larger flare. We'd have just kept banging and banging on the door, knowing what I know now. We made extensive efforts to notify. I might have walked over there myself, knowing what I know now. But I think the efforts we made, that our agents made, were reasonable at the time.
Good copy. And do you have a ballpark of the number of private sector entities that you have to notify of these types of breaches?
Hundreds and thousands. In this particular case, we had to notify hundreds, I think maybe more than 1,000 entities that the Russians were hitting at the same time.
Admiral Rogers, do you have anything to add to that?
No, because as we passed the information to the FBI, what started all this was a pretty massive effort on the part of our Russian counterparts.
I've said this many times. The outcome of Grizzly Step, what the intelligence community refers to as the Russian hacking, has been the wedge, whether real or perceived, between the executive branch, the intelligence community, and the public. And this is an asymmetrical tool that the Russians are using in order to destabilize liberal democratic institutions. And I think it is important that we do everything we can to review this, which I fully believe federal law enforcement is doing, as y'all have talked to here. And I'd like to end before yielding back to the chairman. My colleague from California, the ranking member, said in his opening statement, the question most people have is whether we can really conduct this investigation in the kind of thorough and nonpartisan manner that the seriousness of the issues merit, or whether the enormous political consequences of our work will make that impossible. And he adds, the truth is, I don't know the answer. I do. We must. The American people demand this. The future of our democratic institutions demand it, and I'm glad we have two people like y'all involved in this. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time to you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Gowdy's got a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and Ranking Member Schiff for having this hearing. Mr. Chairman, you were talking about Russia long before it became fashionable to talk about Russia. If memory serves me correctly, you referred to Russia as possibly our greatest national security threat post 9/11. And as you know, Chairman, I come from a state with a fellow named Graham, who is also no fan of Russia. So, Director Comey, Admiral Rogers, people in your line of work are incredibly respected, both your current line of work and the work that you came from. And people in my line of work are not. And there's a reason. The justice system is respected, and the political process is not. So this is, while this hearing is important, what's really important is what you do after this hearing. And I want you to go find every single witness who may have information about interference, influence, motive, our response, collusion, coordination, whatever your jurisdiction is, wherever the facts may take you, though the heavens may fall, go do your jobs. Because nature abhors a vacuum. And right now, you can't answer most of the questions, either by policy, by law, or because the investigation has not been complete. Therefore, a vacuum exists, which people in my line of work are more than happy to fill. So I need you to fill. I need you to do it with all deliberate speed. But Director Comey, I think it's also important for my fellow citizens to take note of why the system that you come from, the one that I come from, is respected, and this system that I'm in now is not. What is hearsay?
It's information you don't know of your own personal knowledge, but learned from someone else.
It's an out-of-court statement offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted.
I was trying to be a little less lawyerly.
All right, well, we'll go with your answer. And it is almost never admissible in court. How about anonymous sources? When you were in the Southern District, could you ever call an anonymous source to testify in one of your proceedings?
No.
You couldn't even use hearsay unless there was some widely accepted exception. And what I've heard this morning in some cases is quadruple hearsay. So it would never, a newspaper article would never, ever be admitted as evidence in a courtroom. So the system we respect would laugh you out of court if you came in armed with a newspaper article. But in the political process, that's enough. Let me ask you this, cross-examination. Why are you able to cross-examine witnesses in trial? Why do we have a right to confront witnesses?
Well, it's embedded in our Constitution, and the reason it makes great sense is it's the crucible out of which you get truth.
It is the single best way to elucidate the truth. to test and to probe and to challenge and to test someone's personal exposure to the facts. Cross-examination is the best tool that we have. How do you cross-examine an anonymous source? How do you cross-examine hearsay? I hope that you go find every single witness that you need to talk to and examine every single document. People are counting on you two and your line of work to find the facts. And people are welcome to draw whatever conclusions they want from the facts. But when I hear the word evidence, as I've heard lots and lots this morning, let me ask you this, Director Comey. Are you familiar with any trials where one witness may have said the light was red and one witness may have said the light was green? Does that ever happen?
Yes, that's why you have a trial.
Does it ever happen where one bank teller said the assailant was 5'10" and one said the assailant was 6'2"?
Sure.
So that's evidence. You got evidence he's 6'2" and evidence he's 5'11". He just can't be both. The light can't be red and green. So the word evidence, while fancy and legal, the reality is you find facts and then the finder of the fact can draw conclusions and inferences from those facts. So I wish you luck as you begin this process. It is all important. The fact that someone may have had a line of questions about leaks does not mean that they're not interested in all aspects of Russia. And vice versa, the fact that they may not have asked questions about leaks doesn't mean they're not interested in them. You have jurisdiction over all of it. So God bless you as you go on this journey for the facts. And then people can draw whatever conclusions they want. I hope that you will fill the vacuum that is created when y'all are not able to answer questions. With that, I would yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Comey, this is my final list of questions here. I just want to make sure we get this on the record. Do you have any evidence that any current Trump White House or administration official coordinated with the Russian intelligence services?
Not a question I can answer.
I figured you were going to say that, but I just wanted to make sure we got it on the record. How about Counselor to the President, Kellyanne Conway?
It's the same answer. And as I said earlier, I constantly want to ask people, don't overinterpret the fact that I say I can't comment. I'm not going to comment on anybody.
Well, I think I understand that, but here's the challenge: is that you've announced that that you have this big investigation, but now you've got people that are involved in our government that are, the Secretary of State, for example. These are important players, and the longer this hangs out here, the bigger the cloud is. And I know that you're not going to tell me whether or not you have any evidence, but I can tell you that we don't have any evidence. And we're conducting our own investigation here. And if you have evidence, especially as it relates to people in the White House that are working in the White House or the administration, that would be something that we really should know about, and we should know about quickly. And so if you can't give it to the entire committee, I hope you can at least give it to myself and Mr. Schiff, because there is a big gray cloud that you've now put over people who have very important work to do to lead this country. And so the faster you can get to the bottom of this, it's going to be better for all Americans.
I understand. Thank you.
All right. With that, I want to thank the members today, and especially our witnesses. It was a long day, but I think a good discussion.